Jacob Brown looked into the mirror and stared back at the masculine face that he had grown to tolerate. He had just turned 29 and was experiencing success beyond his wildest expectations. He was the youngest executive at his company and was paid handsomely for the huge sums he earned for the business. Jacob was a svelte man standing 5 feet 8 inches. He carried his 160 pounds well. Jacob had little problem attracting women despite his lack of muscle because of his success. Jacob was that man, but he did not want to be him. Jacob closed his eyes and imagined being someone else. He imagined himself as the woman he felt he should have been born as. It was something Jacob found himself doing multiple times each day. Rarely a wakening hour would go by without his fantasy of becoming a woman crossing his mind. As a child, he wanted to be a girl his age. As he got older, he started to notice older women. By the age of 14, he was daydreaming about his pretty female science teacher. By the age of 15, he was fantasying about being any of his female teachers regardless of their appearance. It was not an exclusive fantasy. Jacob dreamed of being any adult woman as he got older. He fantasized about being old women, young women, fat women, and thin women. He even fantasized about changing races and ethnicities. Shortly after he entered the working world, Jacob's fantasies changed, however. Jacob's strongest fantasy was to become one of the secretaries that worked for his company. He saw them as he walked through every floor of the office building that housed his employer. He observed them, attempting to be careful to not let them realize he was doing so. Whenever they did catch him, he would look away. The longer Jacob worked, the stronger and narrower his fantasy became. Jacob became obsessed with being an older secretary. They seemed to be the most anonymous. They worked for their bosses, but they were not flirted with. Jacob noticed the younger ones were often treated like meat, but the older ones were just dealt with professionally. That's what he wanted. He did not want to be desirable to men. He wanted to be a woman left alone to do her clerical work. Soon though, Jacob was sure that he would be able to live out his fantasy. He planned it all out. He got a leave of absence from his job for 3 months. It took some arm twisting, but Jacob used his relationship with the CEO to get his sabbatical approved. Jacob could not wait to start it. He would be able to be a secretary for 2 months. He had the method of transformation within his grasp as well. Jacob could finally afford the special clinic's charges. He had known of the place for years, but it had always been out of his financial reach. The clinic assured him it could transform into the woman he wanted to be in 2 weeks, and turn him back in 2 weeks as well. Jacob decided that he had to go through with it. Jacob was enthused when he got the confirmation. As Jacob's last act at the company, he appointed his secretary to be in charge of dealing with his clients while he was gone. However, Eve was instructed to hand any non-routine problem off to a fellow executive. Eve was happy to be entrusted with the authority. Jacob was satisfied with her skills and got his superior's approval to let Eve run things when he was gone. Jacob told Eve that he was sending her his friend Caroline Farrell to help out after she finished working for her current employer. He gave Caroline a strong recommendation to Eve, who understood that he wanted her hired. Eve wished him well as he left the building that last evening. Jacob got in his car and headed away from the office. After grabbing dinner, Jacob headed for the clinic. He took a train into the city and took a taxi to the clinic's doors. After paying his fare, Jacob headed towards the clinic. He paused before its doors for a minute as he reconsidered what he was doing. Jacob decided that he had come too far to back down. Jacob walked into the clinic and checked himself in. The introductory questionnaire asked what he would like to look like when he finished. He wrote that he wanted to be a 55-year-old, portly woman. The staff took the questionnaire from him and sent him up to his room. Jacob turned on the television as he awaited the staff to come and help transform. After 2 hours, he heard a knock on his door. A woman who appeared to be in her 40s was standing before his door. She introduced herself as Jen and said that she would be his main trainer during his transformation. Jacob shook her hand and followed her into a small room. Jen sat Jacob down on a chair and explained what was going to happen to him. She asked if he was sure that he wanted to gain the weight and look years older. Jacob assured her that he did. Jen huffed and said, "They always say that youth is wasted on the young. I'm not young anymore. I'm 29. I'd kill to be 29, Jen said as she reached into a cabinet and took out a container. Jacob looked at her as Jen took something out of the container before she poured him a glass of water. "Take this," Jen said as she held out a pill and the glass of water. "What will it do?" Jacob asked as he took hold of them. "It's going to enhance your weight gain. It slows your metabolism to a crawl, but it stimulates hunger at the same time." Jacob was a little hesitant to take medication, but he put the pill in his mouth. He swallowed and waited for his next instruction. Jacob was then assigned a number of television shows to watch the rest of the day. He was given some donuts to snack on and sent to his room. The titles primarily started with The Real Housewives of. Jacob realized that he was assigned to watch all of Bravo's original programming. It took some time for Jacob to get into it, but he taught himself to enjoy it. Jacob awoke the next morning and had a big breakfast. Jacob knew that the pill had kicked in because he had never eaten that much in his life. Jacob was then taken in to get his teeth worked on. Jacob had veneers put over his teeth to change his smile. When the veneers were in place, Jacob took in their appearance and was satisfied that it was different enough from his own. Jacob was then taken in for glasses. Jacob had worn contacts since he was 14. Very few people knew that he had corrected vision. Jacob was fitted for color-changing contacts that would make his brown eyes appear blue. Since they were not prescription contacts, Jacob also needed glasses. After a little deliberation, he picked out a pair of burgundy-colored eyeglass frames. While his eyewear was prepared, Jacob was taken in for hair extensions. The stylist gave him shoulder-length brown hair that was slightly lighter than his natural color. Jacob snacked on bagels, croissants, and egg rolls as the woman attached the extensions to his hair. She finished shortly before Jacob was taken for lunch. After lunch, Jacob was taught how to brush his hair and how to style it. After his hair was complete, Jacob was given his contacts and glasses. Jacob took out his contacts and put in the color-changing ones. Through his blurred vision, Jacob could see the difference in the color. Jacob reached for his glasses and looked in the mirror. He noticed how the glasses rested loosely on his head and knew that they had been left loose because of his anticipated weight gain. Jacob smiled and felt he already looked strikingly different because of his eyes, hair, teeth, and increasingly chubby cheeks. After dinner, Jacob went back to his room and watched the shows he was assigned to watch. He took his pill again before he went to bed. After breakfast the next morning, Jacob was quizzed on his knowledge of the television shows he had been assigned to watch. Jacob passed the test easily. He was then schooled on how to talk like a woman. The instructor emphasized a soft-spoken voice that was never to be loud. He was told to have a small voice. Jacob worked on it all day between his various bites of food. As the end of Jacob's 2 weeks at the clinic approached, Jacob felt confident that no one would ever suspect that he was a man, let alone Jacob Brown. He had gained 60 pounds before the weight gain pill's effect wore off. Jacob had also been given an artificial vagina and had breast forms attached to his chest that could only be removed with a special solvent. Jacob was also given a prosthetic nose and chin. He had a few wrinkles added to his face around his eyes. Jacob felt they were a nice finishing touch even though they could hardly be seen because of his glasses. Shortly before he left the clinic, Jacob paused before a mirror. Jacob smiled at his reflection, feeling that he looked every bit his purported 55 years. Jacob was taken from the clinic to a small 2-bedroom home in a working-class neighborhood that was only 3 miles from his own home. He was given a red, hatchback, Toyota Yaris that was a couple years old to drive as well. Jacob walked around his home after the people from the clinic left. The house was decorated with little ceramic figurines. They were predominantly of cats, dolphins, and elephants. The walls were decorated in pastel colors or wallpapers that had various flowers on them. The furniture looked like antiques, but Jacob knew by their feel that they were cheap and new. Everything in the house looked cheap, like it had been bought on a secretary's salary over the years. Jacob walked into the bedroom with the neatly made queen-size bed and opened up his closet. It was filled with women's clothing. There were a dozen skirt suits in different colors and styles. He had 50 pairs of shoes and sneakers. He had some house dresses as well as some casual and evening ones. He had a number of pairs of dress pants and blouses. He went over to his white dresser and saw the underwear drawer filled with panties, pantyhose and tights that were all in solid colors. He opened another drawer and found some t-shirts and sweatshirts. The next drawer revealed several pairs of women's sweatpants. Jacob smiled as he closed the drawers. He knew that he really had a middle-aged woman's wardrobe. Jacob headed into his kitchen and made himself dinner before he went into the living room. After a few hours of watching television, Jacob went to bed. The next morning, Jacob awoke and began his new routine. He showered and dressed in a skirt suit and a blouse. He put on his makeup and brushed his hair straight. Jacob then ate breakfast, checked his purse and put on his 3-inch heel patent leather shoes before he headed out the door. Jacob walked over to his car and pulled it out of the driveway. He drove to the office building that housed his employer. He parked in an unreserved spot for the first time in 5 years. Jacob stepped out of the car and collected himself as he looked up at the building. He pulled out his compact mirror and checked his appearance. Jacob smiled at the dowdy middle-aged woman staring back at him. He then headed for the door. Jacob walked into his office for the first time in 2 weeks. He looked around at the familiar faces that barely noticed his presence. Eve looked up at him and said, "Caroline Farrell?" "Yes," Jacob replied as he walked towards her and shook her hand. Eve showed him into his office and introduced herself. Jacob sat in the guest chair as Eve took Jacob's usual place in his executive's chair behind the desk. Eve smiled and said, "Caroline, can I call you Caroline?" "Of course," Jacob replied. Eve said, "I've seen your resume. It's quite extensive. You're more than qualified. The boss even gave you a recommendation." Jacob smiled and replied, "Oh, Mr. Brown gave me a recommendation?" "Yes, he did. To be honest, I'm not really in a position to refuse his suggestions, so you got the job." Jacob smiled and said, "Thank you, dear." "You're welcome, Caroline. Can you start tomorrow?" "Certainly," Jacob replied with glee that could not be hidden. Jacob eagerly awaited his first workday at the office. He wanted to know what his fellow employees thought of him, but he also wanted to feel like one of the secretaries he so admired. Jacob headed into the office building and went into the company's quarters. He walked in and saw Eve standing by the water cooler. She smiled at him and said, "Caroline, it's nice to see you again. Let me show you to your work desk." Jacob followed Eve to her familiar desk. Eve pulled the seat out for him and said, "This is usually my desk, but while Mr. Brown is away I'm using his. If the company keeps you when he comes back, you'll probably get a new desk and a new boss. For now, anyway, this will have to do." "It'll do just fine," Jacob replied. Eve continued to smile and responded, "Well, I guess we should go over some ground rules. Even though I'm technically still a secretary, just like you, I have been put in charge of Mr. Brown's work while he's away. So you're going to be working underneath me. You'll be my assistant." "That sounds splendid." Eve smirked and put down a file on his desk. She said, "Please type these up for me." "Certainly," Jacob replied in a chipper tone. Jacob went about typing up the forms and carried them into Eve's office when he was done. Eve took them and said, "Can you get me a cup of coffee, 1 milk, 1 sugar?" Jacob nodded and made Eve a cup and brought it back to her, feeling every bit her secretary. Eve took a sip and smiled and gave an approving nod. She then said, "I need you to bring these up to Mrs. Daniels' secretary upstairs. She's to the right when you get off the elevator." Jacob took the file from Eve's hand and said, "Right away, Eve." Jacob hurried through the office and into the elevator. He pressed the button for the 4th floor. He walked through the familiar office scene and saw Mrs. Daniels' secretary Clarissa. He had never said much to her over the years, and she kept her distance from the secretaries on the lower floors. She was the secretary to the vice president of the company and liked to hold her position over the secretaries of lesser executives. Jacob handed the file to Clarissa and said, "From the office of Jacob Brown." Clarissa took it and said, "I'll get it to Mrs. Daniels." Clarissa never made eye contact with him. Jacob felt a little tingle inside as he felt arousal over being ignored by her. He saw Mrs. Daniels exit her office. She gave him a brief look and went about ignoring him. Jacob smirked as he walked away from them. Mrs. Daniels always gave him such praise when he was Jacob Brown. Jacob reveled in the thought that, now that he was Caroline the secretary, she was ignoring him. Jacob loved the lowly feeling that was enveloping him. Jacob went back down to his desk and saw a pile of papers sitting in his inbox. Jacob went to work. He worked furiously until lunchtime came. With Eve's meal handled by a secretary who was picking up meals for all the executives, Jacob was free to go out and get a meal of his own. He did not go out with the other secretaries because he did not want to feel like he was intruding upon them. He went to a small restaurant and picked up a meal to go. He ate it at his desk before he started to work again. As the day drew on, Jacob felt his feet start to hurt. He knew it was the heels. During his training at the clinic, his feet would always start to hurt after prolonged wearing of them. It was something Jacob felt he needed to get used to since all the women he worked with had. Jacob continued to go through forms and make deliveries for Eve. He paused whenever he could to massage his calves. He knew his greatest relief would be when he took off his shoes at the end of the day. As the end of the workday approached, Jacob felt disappointed that no one was talking about him in the office. Eve was quiet when Jacob asked her about him. She was evasive about the subject. Jacob figured that she thought that Caroline was friendly with him. Jacob guessed that she thought she might get in trouble if she criticized him. The other employees seemed to have no opinion of the man. He was simply a presence in the office that they did not concern themselves with. Jacob knew that he might be a big deal with his superiors and other executives, but the support staff was not concerned with him. He realized that his fascination with them was a one-way street. After work, Jacob drove to a supermarket that was close to his home. Jacob walked into the supermarket he had entered hundreds of times before. He garnered no more attention as a middle-aged woman than he did as a young man. He pushed his shopping cart through the aisles and picked out what he wanted. Jacob turned down an aisle and saw two 12-year-olds standing in the aisle. They let him pass by them. As Jacob moved down the aisle, he heard one of them reference a fat woman. Jacob knew they were talking about him. He smiled to himself as he pushed his cart forward. He put the last item on his list into the cart and headed for the cashier. Jacob smiled as he looked at Amber. She was a young woman who he thought was about 25. She was always nice to him. She seemed to enjoy lavishing attention on him. Jacob moved towards her and put his items on the belt and watched as Amber ran up and packed his groceries. Jacob smiled to himself as Amber largely ignored his presence. She simply went about her business with little small talk. Jacob was delighted by how anonymous he had become. Jacob knew that Amber only spoke to him in such a reverential way after she saw his car and found out what he did. Now, whatever job Jacob worked was inconsequential. He was a portly, old woman in Amber's eyes and not a desirable, fit young man. Jacob handed over his money and got his receipt. Amber gave him an unenthusiastic "have a nice day" before Jacob headed away from the register. Jacob pushed his cart out of the building and towards his car. The next morning, Eve searched through Jacob's records as she looked for a file about an important client. She perused the various documents looking for the relevant papers. She paused as she came across a file whose only identifying mark was a phone number on its cover. The area code matched the client's, so Eve opened the file. The file contained only 2 documents. They were email confirmations from a company only identified by its phone number. Eve thought the files seemed sketchy. Ever the social climber, she decided to look up the number. Eve searched it online, but she found no details attached to it. Seeing a potential to blackmail her boss, Eve decided she had no choice but to call the number. She dialed the number and waited for an answer. She heard a ring followed by a strange electronic noise. Eve jerked the phone away from her head, but she then heard an automated statement, "Number approved. We value of our clients. Please wait while we transfer your call." A woman's voice came over the phone, "Ms. Farrell, how can we assist you?" Throwing her voice as best she could, Eve responded, "Oh, I'm sorry. I dialed the wrong number. I'm not used to dialing numbers for someone else. It's hard not having a secretary do it for you anymore, huh?" "Yes, it is. I've got to go. I'm getting some looks from the other girls," Eve said in a hushed voice. The woman hung up after replying, "We understand. The transition is not always easy. Don't hesitate to call if you have any further questions." Eve closed the file, folded it, and put it into her purse. She started to peruse her other files, but found it taxing. She decided to ask Jacob to locate it. Jacob saw Eve coming out of his office. She came over and said, "Caroline, I need you to help me find the file for the Mueller account." "Of course, Eve," Jacob responded. He got to his feet and headed into the office. He saw the strewn about files and grimaced. He saw that its location had not been searched by Eve yet. He decided not to let on that he knew where it was, so he searched other spots first. Eve smirked at his clumsy attempt to feign a lack of knowledge of the location before he found it. Eve thanked him and said, "Now, run along, girl." Jacob nodded and smiled as he walked out the door. Eve smirked as she watched him walk to his desk, as she was sure that she had discovered his true identity. As lunchtime approached, Eve sent Jacob out to pick up her lunch and the lunches of the other executives. Jacob had no choice but to comply. As Jacob was getting her lunch, Eve went to her old desk and pulled out Jacob's file. Jacob had made her do his personal errands for years, and she kept track of his sensitive information for easy reference. She looked at Jacob's various credit card numbers and called the companies. She had them all canceled before Jacob walked in the door. After lunch, she left the building and went to a public library. She logged into Jacob's online bank account and engaged in a series of suspicious activities. Eve smiled at the message saying the account was locked. Eve knew the bank would require him to come in person to reactivate it. Eve walked back to the office feeling triumphant. She saw Jacob sitting at her old desk as she walked towards her office door. He looked up at her with a smile and handed her some forms. Eve took them and said, "Thank you, Caroline." Eve closed the office door and put the forms on the table. She took out the sheet with Jacob's information on it and shredded it. She then shredded his confirmations from the company. She left the empty file in her bag so she could dispose of it at home. Eve smiled at Jacob as he exited the building looking like a middle-aged woman. She had cut him off from his wealth, but she wondered if he had set aside money someplace else. She knew that only time would tell if her efforts were in vain. After Jacob's first week as a Caroline came to an end, he received a call from the clinic. They told him that they had not received their automated rent payment for the home and car for the week. Jacob was sure they were mistaken. They assured him that they could not withdraw money from his accounts. Jacob gave them his credit card information, but the clinic assured him the accounts were canceled. Jacob asked how much it would be. The company responded with a number that comprised 2/3 of his weekly take-home salary. Jacob frowned as he realized that his hopes of indulging during his time in a feminine-looking form were momentarily slashed. He told them he would be paid his first check comprising his first 2 weeks' salary the next week and asked if he could pay for both weeks then. The clinic obliged him and hung up. Jacob then tried to log onto his bank account, but it was frozen. Jacob looked up how to get it reactivated, but he found out quickly that he had to go there in person. Jacob started to shake as he realized that he had lacked the money or assets as Caroline Farrell to pay for his transformation back. He needed to be Jacob to get the money to become Jacob again. Jacob started to think about disguising himself as himself. He searched his mind as he tried to figure a way to impersonate the man he had recently been. He would have to do it the next weekend because the bank was already closed that Saturday evening, and he worked during its weekday hours. When Jacob got back to the office on Monday, he found that the staff was preparing for the big meeting with the Muellers. One of the company's most important clients, Jacob was due back to deliver the sales pitch to the Muellers in 2 months. He gave Eve detailed instructions on how to prepare for the meeting. However, Eve had gotten Jacob's boss's permission to move up the meeting and do it without him to get an advantage on the competition. Eve delegated the work to Jacob. Jacob found himself doing all the work he had pushed off on Eve as well as her errands. Jacob felt overburdened. He felt that Eve was working him harder than he had worked her. While Jacob did her work, Eve would walk around the office and sweet-talk the other executives on the floor. She presented the work Jacob had done for her to his boss, Mr. McDuff. The boss gave a hard look at the work and praised Eve for its quality. Eve thanked him without even noting that her secretary had any hand in it. On Wednesday, Mr. McDuff came back down to the floor. He called for everyone's attention. All the executives left their offices and came out to hear him. Mr. McDuff announced, "There has been some suspicious activity involving Jacob Brown." Jacob stared at his boss with a slack jaw. He started to tremble as Mr. McDuff continued, "His bank accounts have been frozen because of this activity. We tried to reach him where he said he was, but the hotel told us he never arrived. A missing persons report has been filed about him. Given the evidence, the police expect foul play. I will keep you all posted about this subject if anything else develops. Thank you for your time." Mr. McDuff turned and left the room filled with stunned faces. Jacob felt a tear come to his eye. Eve put her arms around him and said, "It'll be okay, Caroline. I'm sure he's fine. I'm sure you guys go way back considering his vote of confidence in you. Just have hope." Jacob nodded and thanked Eve. Jacob got back to work researching and typing up reports for Eve. As the workday ended, a few of the other secretaries came over to Jacob. Veronica said, "Caroline, me and the other girls are going out to our weekly spot. We want you to come along. We feel like we don't know you yet. This would be big for you fitting in around here." Jacob nodded at the middle-aged woman and said, "I'd be delighted to go with you girls." Jacob met the girls at the bar Veronica had told him about. He saw them standing before the door. Jacob said hello to Veronica, Heidi, Bethany, and Courtney. They then went inside and paid the cover charge. It took Jacob a few minutes before he realized what type of establishment the place was. Jacob figured out it was a strip club for women. Veronica smiled and said, "Our husbands would kill us if they knew, but they do it too." Jacob nodded with a forced smile. They ordered drinks and started to talk about various things around the office. They asked Jacob about how he felt about working for Eve. He said it was not bad. Heidi countered that Eve was always domineering when they went out together. Jacob shrugged and said, "She's an assertive woman." Veronica, translation, "She's a bitch." Jacob joined the others 4 girls in laughter before their conversation continued. Eventually, Heidi asked, "Caroline, have you ever been here before?" "No. It's not my type of place." Veronica nodded and said, "I know it can be a bit much, that's why Eve stopped coming." Heidi interjected, "That's why I picked this place." Jacob laughed with the girls as he wondered just how long the girls had frozen out Eve. He had never picked up on it. Heidi looked at Bethany, who was one of the younger secretaries. She then motioned to Jacob. Jacob asked, "What?" Bethany smiled and said, "Heidi thinks you need you lap dance." "No, I'll pass." The girls all chimed in that he should do it, and Veronica said, "Come on, do it. We've all had one here. It's sort of an initiation." "I'm really not." Heidi laughed and said, "I understand why Eve hired you. You're just as big of a prude." Veronica countered, "Hey, at least Caroline's old enough to justify being one. Check your own sensibilities when you're our age." Bethany smirked and said, "You're the biggest spender here, Veronica." "Well, when you go through the drought I've been through at home, you'll understand why." Heidi shook her head with a smile and said to Jacob, "You really have to do it. Just once, and we'll never bother you again about it." Jacob blushed, put his chin into his chest and shook his head. Veronica said, "Come on, we'll pay. Heidi, go pick out a nice one." "How do you like them?" Heidi asked Jacob. Jacob shook his head, feeling the redness in his cheeks. Jacob watched Heidi pay the man dressed as a policeman. He came over towards him. Jacob went to move, but Veronica grabbed his shoulder and gave him $1 to put in the man's briefs. Jacob cringed as the man looked down at him and introduced himself as Officer Nasty before he started thrusting by Jacob's face. Officer Nasty straddled Jacob's chair and started to move about in a motion that made Veronica squeal and the younger girls laugh. The man saw the dollar and held open his brief to allow the entry. Jacob went to stick it in, but Veronica caught his arm. Bethany lectured, "Do it with your teeth." "My teeth?" "Bite the dollar and put it in. That's how it's done." Jacob hesitantly put as little of the dollar as he could in his mouth. He leaned in and felt his nose touch the man's six-pack before the dollar was out of his teeth. The girls cheered and the man finished his routine. The girls tipped him some more, and he went on his way. Bethany smiled and said, "You really didn't look like you enjoyed that." "It's not my thing." "I hope you liked it though." Bethany replied, "I sure did. I like watching men objectify themselves. I don't think it's erotic. I only like men that are only mine, but I do find these guys funny." Heidi interjected, "Veronica's really the only one who likes it." "With age comes wisdom," Veronica responded. The next day at work, Jacob was back to work doing his normal work plus Eve's errands. Jacob's only relief came from the occasional conversation he had with the other secretaries. They were the only meaningful conversations he had anymore, and he cherished them. As the workweek wore on, Jacob grew increasingly anxious about his upcoming trip to the bank. Jacob knew the stakes and they wore on him as he did his work. Jacob stopped at the Salvation Army on his way home from work Friday. He selected a number of men's clothes and paid at the register. He then headed to his home to plan for the next day. Jacob woke up early Saturday morning and got himself ready to go out as Jacob. He picked through the clothes he picked up at the thrift shop. He put on the baggy men's shirt and baggy jeans before he put on his oversized coat. He felt that his feminine-looking form was sufficiently covered. He took out his color contacts and put on a pair of non-prescription glasses from the convenience store. He could not see well in them, but he figured that they were at least in a men's style. Jacob made sure his face was makeup-free and put his hair up under a baseball cap. He looked into the mirror at the person staring back at him and looked at the picture on his mail license. Jacob knew he looked a lot different, but he figured it was worth a shot. Jacob knew that if he failed, he would be stuck as Caroline for years. The clinic would not front him the money to change back, and it would take him at least 6 years as Caroline to earn enough to change himself back into Jacob. At that point, he might be declared legally dead. He would be stuck with having to come up with a difficult explanation for his disappearance. If he was thought to have pulled something like a multi-year disappearance, he knew that he would never be trusted with an important job again. Jacob drove down to the bank and walked inside and approached a banker as he put his hands into a pair of gloves to hide his nails. He gave the banker the account numbers he was trying to activate. The banker looked at Jacob skeptically and asked for identification. Jacob provided it. The man paused and looked at him and said, "Ma'am, do you really expect me to believe you're the man in this ID? You're clearly a woman impersonating a man." You look ridiculous. Now, I'm going to give you to the count of 5 to get the hell out of here or I'm calling the cops. Jacob nodded and stood up. He hurried towards the door and to his car. Jacob tried not to be upset, but the situation was bearing down on him. Jacob knew that he was trapped as Caroline. Tears started to roll down his cheeks. The tears were followed by the shame Jacob felt for behaving like the woman he appeared to be. He was crying like a scared girl. He felt that he was every bit the woman he had wanted to become for a little while. As Jacob headed home, he knew that he might be that woman for the rest of his life. Jacob started work the next Monday with apprehension. He knew the meeting with the Muellers was a week away and felt that Eve was not up to the job. She handed off all her work to him and he wondered if she had the discipline to give a concerted pitch. Jacob was a little relieved that Mr. Macduff had let her continue to take the lead on it, however, because he did not want another executive to take over the count. Mr. Macduff seemed satisfied with Eve's work product, which was actually Jacob's. As the meeting date grew near, Jacob approached Eve and asked if he could be any assistance in her preparation. "No, you've done enough for me," Eve responded. "Well, perhaps I could help you with your delivery. I know you're new to this. I've been around a while." "Yes, you have, Caroline, and you're still a secretary," Eve responded coolly, eager to put Jacob in his place. Jacob was stung. He had never heard Eve speak that way to anyone. He instantly understood the other secretary's complaints about her. Eve looked up at him and said, "If you want to make yourself useful, type up these reports for me after you get me a cup of coffee. 1 sugar this time. Don't forget again." Jacob nodded and headed out of the room with the forms in his hands. He felt a little embittered by how Eve spoke down to him, but he had to do his job. Jacob knew that he needed it too much to show anything resembling a spine. Jacob was slightly aroused by the thought. He liked needing the job. It fulfilled his fantasies even as it was relegating him to a life of mundane, underpaid work. Jacob looked around the office and noticed that he was still as valuable as he was as Jacob Brown, but no one noticed anymore. No one cared that he did all of Eve's work. He was just her tool, and everyone knew it. He was just another secretary, no matter how hard he worked. The girls offered him a welcome respite from his office work. Jacob was more comfortable at the weekly hangout and talked more freely with the girls. He talked most frequently with Bethany, Heidi, and Veronica. Jacob said a few words to Courtney, but she was very introverted. She only seemed to open up to Bethany, who was a few years older than her. Jacob figured that she felt out of place among them given that she was only a year out of college. Veronica was Jacob's closest confidant among the girls. She was the closest in age to the person he claimed to be, even though Bethany was the closest in age to the person Jacob had been born as. Jacob felt more comfortable with Veronica though. Outside of Veronica's sex drive, they thought alike to a striking degree. Veronica knew that Jacob carried the load for Eve and helped him whenever she could. Jacob had lunch with Veronica every day and listened to her problems at home with her husband and kids. The two exchanged office gossip and shared a deep knowledge of the shows on Bravo. After Jacob got Eve her lunch, he sat down and ate with Veronica. Veronica looked at Jacob and asked how the Muellers' presentation was going. Jacob gave her his best estimation before Veronica said, "I hope she does it well. They're a good client and she's no Mr. Brown." Jacob smirked and said, "No, she's not." Veronica shook her head and said, "I heard that he was last seen alive in an alleyway." "Don't believe everything you hear," Jacob responded. Bethany overheard them and said, "Are you talking about Mr. Brown?" "Yes," Veronica answered. "I heard he went overseas to get a mail-order bride and got whacked." "Whacked?" Jacob exclaimed with mild amusement. He giggled as he listened to the wild rumors of his demise. "What's so funny?" Veronica asked. "Nothing. We don't know what happened to him. There are no leads, so this is all wild speculation." Heidi came over and countered, I heard from Mr. Macduff himself that he heard that someone said that Mr. Brown is down in Mexico working as a professional wrestler under the name El Guapo. I can't believe that. He's too small. What was he, like 5 feet 8 inches? Veronica responded. That's what I heard. He was thin too. Those guys would kill him, Bethany interjected. Jacob just smiled as they talked about his potential whereabouts as he sat among them. He knew it did not matter. Jacob accepted that Jacob Brown was out of reach. The longer he thought about it, the more he realized that Caroline Farrell was who he was going to be forevermore. By the time he could pay to be Jacob again, it would be too late. Jacob knew he had to accept the hand he felt that fate had dealt him. The next Monday was the day of the meeting with the Muellers. Jacob was nervous about how Eve would perform in his place. She had never seemed particularly interested in the work of an executive, as she always handed off difficult work to him. Eve shook hands with the Muellers when they arrived. Jacob watched her pitch with a slack jaw. Eve seemed to morph herself into someone else. She was smiling, charming, and captivated the Muellers. They were impressed with her words. Despite an early mention of Jacob by the Muellers, he seemed to be forgotten as they fell for Eve's pitch. Mr. Macduff witnessed part of the meeting and was impressed as well. Once the new deal was in place with the Muellers, Mr. Macduff called for the office's attention. He looked around the room and said, "Folks, we have to deal with some hard truths. Jacob Brown's still missing, and we all know he's not likely to come back. It's a sad truth, but we must face it. We have to carry on though. His job needs to be done. You all know that he left Eve in charge of doing his work while he was gone, and she's succeeded. He chose his replacement well. That's why I've decided to honor his choice. I'm offering Eve his old job. What do you say, Eve?" Jacob looked on in shock as he realized that the office was moving on without him. Even if he returned, he would be out a job. Jacob knew his only place in the company going forward was as Caroline. Eve smiled and put her hands over her mouth before she replied, "I accept." Mr. Macduff shook her hand. The other executives followed suit. Then the secretaries congratulated her. Jacob waited to congratulate her last. Eve smirked at him and said, "I couldn't have done it without you." Jacob nodded, partially out of resignation of his fate. Eve put her hand on his shoulder and said, "I need you to come into my office." Jacob followed her into his old office. Eve took a seat, but did not tell him to sit, so Jacob stood. Eve smiled and said, "You've done a good job for me these last few weeks." "Thanks, Eve," Jacob responded. "Oh, yes, we have to change that. I'm now officially your boss, so I can't have you calling me by my first name. It's not proper anymore. You have to call me Miss Barber. Okay?" "Yes, Miss Barber," Jacob replied as he realized how much their positions had changed. His secretary was now the powerful young executive, while he was in a worse position than Eve had ever known. He was now working her old job, but he lacked her youthful good looks. Eve continued, "Mr. Macduff honored my predecessor's choice to replace him by giving me his job. I feel that I should do the same for you. Jacob recommended you, and I have to say you were a great choice on his part. You've really worked out for me." Jacob nodded sullenly at the smiling young woman. "I'd be happy to keep you around, but I need to find out if you're capable of working under a woman full-time, so I'm going to have put you on a sort of probation here. Now, go fetch me a cup of coffee, and we'll come back and talk about the do's and don'ts you'll have to follow if you want to work for me." "Yes, Miss Barber." "Right away," Jacob replied as he turned away from Eve.